With $100 sent by his father, he bought a copy of the same set, which he got somewhat cheaper, paying only $90 for it, and with the remaining $10 he bought a huge piece of cheese for his wife, and they had to eat cheese for 15 days.
Who is Fidel Castro really? As a boy, he studied at a Jesuit school in Santiago de Cuba, and since his youth, he stood out as a student leader, especially at Havana University. He's the son of a Spanish emigrant from El Ferrol and a Cuban mother. One of the persons who knows his childhood years best is his own sister, Juana Castro.
Yo recuerdo cuando pequeña, lógicamente no me daba cuenta de las cosas realmente como eran.
I recall my childhood. Of course, I didn't realize how things really were, or why for that matter. However, as an adult, analyzing it all, I recollect how we looked forward to spending our holidays on the beach or somewhere else. I always remember him making the arrangements for the vacation. The whole family, adults and children alike, spent the holiday together. The family accepted his decisions. In those days, I used to think that it was the adults who took the decisions. Now I believe that it was Fidel who in the end decided how and where we spent our vacations. I think that this can serve to illustrate what the Cuban people are unfortunately enduring today, the way in which a single man decides, arranges and organizes everything.
Upon my arrival at Sierra Maestra, the first day I was with Fidel at his headquarters, and I took notice of the books he had there. I presented him with The Power Elite by Wright Mills, the American sociologist, and I was able to take a look at the books he had in his guerrilla encampment. And the book he seemingly read fairly often was Marshal Mannerheim's book on military tactics.
After the failure of Batista's military offensive in August 1958, Castro launched his own. The United States declared an arms embargo on the regime, and Cuban communists presumably decided at last to support the idea of armed struggle. Guevara set out for Las Villas province with 148 men, and Camilo Cienfuegos did likewise towards Pina del Rio province with 82 men. A few months later, by the end of December, the regime collapsed following Che Guevara's capture of Santa Clara City after decisively defeating a demoralized army. Batista fled during the small hours of the morning of the 1st of January 1959. That same day, people dashed into the streets once more to celebrate the overthrow of the dictatorship of the man who 26 years before had overthrown another Cuban dictator, Gerardo Machado. The circle had closed. A new era was about to begin. Although they weren't characteristic, a few scenes occurred in which people took justice into their own hands. Homes of certain Batista's partisans were plundered. Some of them, the closest ones, were able to escape with Batista. A few of the rest faced a vengeful crowd. Nevertheless, there was a substantial difference. This time an army arrived from Sierra Maestra and had not only overthrown the dictatorship, but had also defeated the regular army as well. The new rebel army had in its hands, without knowing it, a country that was falling to pieces as it triumphantly entered Havana. And leading this army was its commander-in-chief, Fidel Castro.
No more trouble at all from the Batista people, do you?
No, the Batista finished forever in Cuba.
La mayoría del movimiento 26 de julio del directorio revolucionario.
Most of us in the 26th of July movement and the revolutionary directorate who had carried out the struggle against Batista, in which the Communist Party had taken no part, wanted to carry on a new revolution, starting out from the historical experience in America and the world, and avoiding the dangers of the Russian Revolution, its dogmatism, its lack of freedom.
The Cuban Revolution should be a humanistic one, Fidel Castro used to repeat tirelessly during the first few months. All revolutionaries would have a say in a democratic and pluralistic process.
Comandante, what is the future now of the 26th of July movement, now that you have a provisional government?
a 26 July movement, as soon as the life, constitutional or legal life of the country be reestablished, would organize itself, will be organized by their leaders as a political party, because it is the only way.
As a political party?
Yes, of course. And it is the only way in a democracy for the political activity.
Yet something disquieting began to happen. The trials of Batista's partisans. The firing squads hadn't stopped since the beginning of the war in the Sierra Maestra. After the triumph, hundreds of prisoners were executed after being sentenced in trials that looked more like a Roman circus than a legal procedure. The new Cuban president was an honest judge named Manuel Urrutia. Castro began taking decisions about everything, and he was simply referred to as the Maximo leader, the supreme leader.
I think Cuba will enter a new period in which democracy and liberty will be the rule in Cuba.
This situation didn't last long, and in February 1959, Prime Minister Miro Cardona was forced to resign so that Castro could take his place. Would a change in policy occur now that Castro was Prime Minister? It was too soon to answer that question.
One other thing, will there be any change in policy between Cuba and the United States?
No, the best relations. I expect to have the best relations with the United States.
How about the American business interests here? Do they have anything to fear from the revolutionary government?
No.
Nevertheless, an interesting fact must be pointed out. Castro's brother Raul took charge of the armed forces. A few days later, surprisingly enough, Castro announced on television that he would travel to the United States at the invitation of the American press. Castro arrived in the United States on April the 15th, and he had been invited by newspaper editors. The US spread wide its arms to receive the hero it had partially created with its ardent yearning for heroism. Once again, Castro talked about his political ideas.
I know you are worried. First of all, we are communists. And of course, I have said very clear that we are not communists. Very clear.
It's sometimes suggested, for instance, that Castro was driven towards communism by his visit to the United States in April 1959. I doubt that. It's quite true that Eisenhower, being himself rather uncertain as to whether the regime was on the right wavelength or not, didn't see Castro on that private visit to Washington. But Nixon did. And sometimes it's suggested that apparent neglect on the part of President Eisenhower was the reason why Castro took a pronounced leftward turn. I can't believe, actually, that any serious Democrat, and anxious to re-establish the constitution of a country which had been destroyed by a right-wing dictator, who really wanted to see a situation in which there was an official opposition created, would have been diverted from a chosen course simply because the President of the United States asked the Vice President to see him rather than see him himself.
Back from the United States, Castro passed the Agrarian Reform Act, the first practical measure taken by the revolution. Nevertheless, during the second week of June, something unexpected happened. Castro dismissed all the liberal ministers from the cabinet, 6 in all, and replaced them with more radical men attached to him. Weeks later, he strengthened his relations with the communists, especially with Carlos Rafael Rodriguez.
Pero ya empezó toda la táctica y la estrategia de las campañas anticomunistas.
But then the tactics and the strategy of the anti-communist campaign started, and simultaneously our campaign in favor of unity, explaining what the revolution was about. We started to fight anti-communism because it was a weapon against our revolution.
In Washington, no one knew what was going on in Cuba. President Urrutia, who had formally and openly stated his anti-communist attitude, was forced to resign in mid-July. During a TV presentation, Castro attacked him and accused him of being on the brink of treason.
Finally, it would have been much better if the personality we so unselfishly entrusted with the presidency of the Republic would have begun to